This beautiful blouse is another free Tiana's Closet pattern. It's the Maribel sleeveless top featuring a V neckline at the front and back as well as front and back waistline tucks. The center front and center back seams allow for the absolute easiest V-neck binding, and the tucks are a unique method of cinching in that waistline. To transfer my tuck lines, I'm using a trusty heat erasable pen, which gives quick, clear markings, and I know they'll disappear 100% with the heat of the iron. I'll link them below. I have used a Black Palms print burnout jersey knit from Boho Fabrics. The pattern does call for knit fabrics, but I'm pretty sure with the ease of the neckline, armholes, and waist, you could get away with a woven fabric just fine. Either way, I have used straight stitches throughout. Now let's sew a great new summer top. Here is the wrong side of one of my front pieces, and I'm ready to mark the rectangles. You can use a tracing wheel and tracing paper for this step, but I'm just going to use scissors to cut out each rectangle. And since I find that my heat erasable pen erases most reliably, I'll place the pattern piece onto the wrong side of the fabric and draw the vertical edges of each of the 5 rectangles. Now, starting with one set of lines, I'll pin them together just as I would a dart, just folding the fabric right sides together along those parallel lines, pinning through one line and out the other. Then sewing those vertical lines for each set of rectangles one at a time. I'll start at the top and end at the bottom, backstitching at both sides to secure. Do this for all 5 rectangles for both front pieces and both back pieces. Now that I've sewn those tucks for both front pieces and both back pieces, I've pressed each of the tucks toward their respective side seams, letting the heat of the iron erase my markings. Now I'll place my back pieces right sides together with both of these front pieces, and I'll pin the shoulder seams, as well as both of the side seams. So I'm going to be leaving the center front and center back seams open for now. I'll sew each of my shoulder seams and each of the side seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance using a narrow zigzag stitch. If your fabric frays or if you simply prefer, you can finish the raw edges. I've chosen to keep the edges of the seam raw and I've pressed them open. Now, working from the right side of the fabric, I'm going to start binding the neckline. So this is now the right side of my back and front connected pieces. I'm going to be binding from the center back around the shoulder to the center front. I've cut a 1-inch strip of binding from my main fabric, and I'll place the raw edge right sides together with the raw edge of the neckline and pin in place from center front to center back. Now I'm going to sew that binding in place from one side to the other with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then I'll press my binding upward and to the wrong side right along that stitching line. Now that I have my binding completely pressed to the inside around the top edges, I'm going to top stitch from center front to center back with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And repeat to bind the top edges of your opposite front and back piece, sewing it in place with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, turning it to the inside and top stitching at 1/2 inch. Now that the bindings are completed across the top, place your front and back piece right sides together with the opposite front back piece. And pin your center front and center back, and sew both seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. finishing the raw edges if you prefer. Here is my center front seam pressed open. Use a needle and thread to tack down both of the seam allowances on either side of the center front. And repeat that tacking for both seam allowances for the top of the back piece. I'm just catching a little bit of fabric here from the seam allowance and from the binding so that the stitches are invisible from the outside of the garment. For the armholes, the process of binding will be very similar to the neckline. I've cut once again a 1-inch strip of fabric. I'm going to take one of the short edges and fold it to the wrong side by about 1/4 of an inch. Then place that folded edge right sides together with the underarm seam. And I'll continue pinning around the armhole. Once I've attached the binding all the way around, I'll allow the loose end to overlap the folded edge by about 1/2 of an inch and pin in place, and then trim off any excess binding. Then I'll sew the binding to the armhole all the way around with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now we can press that arm binding away from the garment and to the inside along the seam line, just as we did for the neckline binding. Once again, in the same way as the neckline, I'm going to top stitch all the way around with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and repeat for both armholes. Here is the bottom of the garment, and I've gone ahead and pressed that bottom raw edge to the wrong side by about 3/4 of an inch all the way around. Now I'm going to edge stitch close to the raw edge on the inside all the way around. And now your top is complete. Thank you for watching. Here's the final result. I have sewn the extra small and all of my straight stitches worked out just fine, lots of ease to get in and out of the garment with no problems. Subscribe for more full-length sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.